Okay, well, I want to thank you for the invitation. I guess I'll get rolling in a few minutes late, and I'm going to try to go through this fairly quickly. I've only got about 282 slides to get through, so I'll flash them by at about 2 seconds apiece, okay? No, not really. I'm Mike Truax. I'm the president of the 1904 World's Fair Society here in St. Louis, although I don't live in Missouri. I live across the river, and you'll see that in a little bit. Got a couple of my World's Fair Society people on board, our bulletin editor, and another board member. And we're going to talk about the World's Fair for the next 45, 50 minutes or so, and feed you a lot of stuff and pictures to go with the handouts that I hope you had a chance to look at, between the handouts and little booklet and the magazine, etc. Did that stuff get to you a week or so ago?
Yep.
I see a thumbs up. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go into the share screen mode and share my full screen, because I'm going to be switching applications here and there. And this is the PowerPoint slide where we're going to start, and I'm going to go into the full screen mode of that, hopefully. There it goes. Okay, so this started as a facts and oddities about the World's Fair that started getting organized in 1901 and spent the next 3 or 4 years getting things together. Of course, they had to come up with a flag, and that's an early version of a flag. The color one is what they ended up using. This is a list of World's Fairs that you're probably somewhat familiar with. I only listed 3 of the ones in Europe in italicized blue text, and then the bigger ones leading up to St. Louis in boldface. They started back in the middle of the 1800s, and what we call the Victorian World's Fairs finished up before World War I, with a couple of World's Fairs almost simultaneously out in California. You can see the occasions that they were held for in the terms in size of acreage. So since you're not familiar with St. Louis, this is a map of St. Louis. The shaded part of the map is showing St. Louis City proper, and the yellow road around the city shows the majority of the St. Louis metropolitan area, although it extends further out to the west quite a bit. You can see the Mississippi River dividing it, and I live over in Illinois on the right-hand part of the screen. A lot of park areas around St. Louis, and in fact, as we zoom into the city of St. Louis, you can see that big rectangle along Interstate 64, as people in St. Louis call it, Highway 40, and that's Forest Park. And this is a map of Forest Park right along Interstate 64 there. It's about 2 miles wide and about 1 mile north to south, so it's very close to 2 square miles. And some of the larger landmarks and some of the larger streets are labeled there. So next, I'm going to show you a map of the World's Fair cropped, and then I'm going to put them together that shows you where Washington University were, some of the streets around the edge, the History Museum, the Art Museum, which is still here today, of course, and the birdcage. And going back to that map, we'll bring in the World's Fair map and show you that it was in the western half of Forest Park. The eastern half was already developed into a park-like state in the late 1800s, and they didn't want the World's Fair messing with that. So they loaned them the western half of Forest Park as long as they met 2 conditions: built a permanent art museum for them, and also cleared the fairgrounds when it was over. Well, the World's Fair people went out and leased a bunch of land, including Washington University, out to the west of Skinker, and that all became part of the fairgrounds too, making just about 2 square miles. Construction on this site started in very late 1901 with surveying and layout, and then in 1902 they got underway with building some of the large palaces and stuff like that. This effort was just unbelievable when you look at the amount of wood that went into the scaffolding and the framework and sculpture, although this young kid seems more interested in his box of Cracker Jacks than what's going on behind him. Now, I want to hopefully switch very quickly to this same photograph and go into, yeah, that's the same photograph. This is construction of one of the palaces. At a distance, but it's zoomable and it's in great detail. And if you look at these piles of lumber down here, These large pieces of wood are probably 15 or 20 feet long and probably 10 inches square. Some of these are probably 20 feet, maybe 20 feet long, 6 by 8 inches. Here's some big column pieces that are being put together to hold up the roof. And if you look at the verticality and the height of what they were building and going up higher and higher and higher to be able to put together, for example, on these two archways, they would connect these and make this a triumphal arch underneath that for one of the main entrances to the Palace of Liberal Arts. You can also see in the background another palace back here that's a little further along. It actually has a dome done. But I just wanted to show you that image just to give you a sense of size and scale. And that's one of the things that I'm still learning to be amazed at. So on the right is that Palace of Liberal Arts, and that triumphal arch I was just telling you about is right here. And look at the people down here near the base of this statue. Look at the base of the statue. Look at the size of the statue. Look at the roof line, and then look at the statues up there. And I always had to wonder, how did they get that stuff up there? Well, in pieces kind of, but they did it. And look at the size of the people as you go across this 750 feet distance, you know, quite a ways away. By the time you get to the end of this palace also, you're talking almost half a mile away. These obelisks were 140 feet tall. And keep in mind, this was all built in about less than 2.5 years. So I also wanted to show you a close-up of the fairgrounds that was drawn by a man with nothing more than a map and lots of pictures. And this is oriented to be the way most of the maps of the fair is or are, with the main entrance down here at the bottom, because when you go to Disneyland, you always start at the bottom and the main entrance is there, and then you go from there. You kind of lose your directional sense. But this is Art Hill with Festival Hall and the Art Museum behind it. There's 8 large palaces laid out here, and they range from 9 to 14 acres in size. The smaller ones here are about the size of 4 Dillards, 4 large department stores. The birdcage sits right up over here, almost invisible. There you can see the Ferris wheel coming into view. And then across this street is where the Ferris wheel was. And the red brick buildings out here, all the way out to the gymnasium, are Washington University, which was under construction, but was leased for the fair because they were still having classes downtown. And basically the fair people paid them off with enough money to delay their move, which they did because it was profitable to them to do.
Mike, can you go 2 slides back with the palaces and just show talk about the keep going forward, the one with the garden in it, and just talk about yesterday you shared about the sunken garden. One more forward.
Oh, sure. There's the Palace of Liberal Arts there under construction, and they called this the sunken garden. The sunken garden was only about 3 feet below grade, 3 feet down, about 6 or 8 steps, as you can see, not really sunken very much. But especially the left-hand part of that, even in the summertime, was in the shade. So you had a place to sit down and, you know, maybe get a little bit of breeze. Unfortunately, the summer of 1904 was a relatively mild summer temperature-wise in St. Louis. So there weren't very many people passing out from heat exhaustion. Okay, moving on to some of the oddities and amazing things about the fair. Don't worry about those dotted lines, but that kind of bent figure 8 shows a 30-mile L-shaped course that they were challenging people to fly around at a speed of 20 miles an hour, but it was later reduced, and land near the starting point, and offering $100,000 to anybody who could do that. The age of dirigibles was just beginning, and someone in Europe, a European aeronaut, had actually flown a mile or 2, taking off and flying around the Eiffel Tower a couple times and going back to where he landed. He came to St. Louis with his dirigible, but he was unable to get it to fly, and it got damaged, and he said it was sabotaged. But Thomas Baldwin in the United States from California had also invented a dirigible. And since he's the heavyset guy to the left down there, and you'll see him up close in a minute, and his weight was a little bit more than they wanted the dirigible to carry. So he recruited a bicyclist, a thin, wiry guy named Roy Nabenshoe, to fly this. And to fly this thing, and he flew it on a 37-minute flight on one Halloween day, I think it was, up to 2,000 feet high over the fairgrounds, and landed where he took off. He probably never got more than about 8 or 10 miles an hour, but he controlled that airship going. It did have a rudder to turn left and right, but in order to get it to come down, he had to climb on that little contraption up towards the motor where the propeller blade was to get it to aim downward and let out a little bit of gas. And to get it to go upward, he did have some ballast that he could drop. He would go to the back and kind of point that thing upward. The Wright brothers had flown at Kitty Hawk about 4 or 5 months before the fair opened, but their flights back then were straight line. They weren't ready to do turns. They certainly weren't ready to fly miles as this challenge developed. No one won the $100,000. A very special thing at the Pike was a midway. Chicago had pioneered that concept, putting a bunch of attractions. The fair leased a bunch of land, and they put a scenic railway, which was a combination of going past scenes of history and a roller coaster. The Battle Abbey was an American War Museum with some very large cycloramas or dioramas. Jim Key was there, and Jim Key was a horse that had been specially trained. He was a Hambletonian Arabian, and his trainer had raised him to raise money for the new American SPCA. He could read, write, spell, answer math questions, run a post office, make chains, and answer Bible questions. It was never proven if he was being signaled by his trainer, who would leave the stage sometimes, or was he really that intelligent? And he performed at a lot of fairs in Madison Square Garden and raised a lot of money for the SPCA. The Pike also had rides like the Scenic Railway, which I mentioned, a 3-mile roller coaster that went outside the fairgrounds. It had Under and Over the Sea that took people on a simulated submarine ride to Paris, going past sunken ships and buried treasure at the bottom of the ocean. You would then get out of one room and go into another room that looked like an elevator, and the scenery outside the windows would go downward like you were going up the Eiffel Tower. And then you'd get back into another little travel area that was supposedly a large dirigible, and you'd sail back to St. Louis even after coming through a storm, and land where you took off. There were also a lot of foreign lands that exhibited on the Pike, such as Ireland, complete with buildings, theater performances, and restaurants. Blarney Castle had a replica of the Blarney Stone that people would lean out and kiss, as the tradition goes. The Tyrolean Alps was an entire village with restaurants, rides, and fake mountains. And there was a small tram ride inside those mountains, along with a restaurant that could seat over 2,000 people. Those mountains were fake, built on a wooden framework with painted burlap over them. There were also several different countries in Asia that could be visited. Entire villages in different countries with food and theaters and various entertainment, such as Mysterious Asia, etc. The world's second floral clock. The first one was in London, and it was less than half this size, but the second and biggest world's clock for many, many years was made at the World's Fair. It was 112 feet in diameter. The minute hand weighed 2,700 pounds and was 74 feet long. And every minute there was a mechanism up in these little pavilions up at the top that would trigger it and pneumatically send a signal down through a gear to move the minute hand 1 minute. And at its tip, a minute hand would move 6 feet. You can see the various mechanisms, the globe, and then the mechanism, and then something that looks like a grandfather clock in the middle. Off to the left was a 5,000-pound bell that was rung every 30 minutes. And then every 30 minutes, that hourglass on the right would turn over. And in 1989, the World's Fair Society tracked down where this masterworks to that clock ended up from the manufacturer that made it into the hands of a dentist up in Milwaukee. And we arranged its purchase and brought it back to St. Louis. 1904 also was a chance for states to show off their various products and processes, and they did so with a lot of unusual food displays, such as the 3-story Missouri Corn Palace, which was, I think, 55 feet tall. Lot's wife was carved in pure salt, and there was a 30-foot tall statue of King Cotton from Mississippi. California made a prune bear about 10 feet tall. And they also made a horse out of hops that's used in making beer. And California had a lot of products to show. They also made an elephant from almonds. Now, refrigeration was just coming in as a science, and that was big in the Palace of Agriculture. It allowed things to be shipped longer distances without spoiling. And they made whole glass rooms of where they could keep butter chilled down to near freezing. And they found that you could carve hard butter very easily into what you wanted. The top image shows Father Hennepin discovering the source of the Mississippi up in Minnesota. President Roosevelt on horseback, and there is a brace underneath that holding it together. That's all made out of butter, full scale. And then a farmer milking a cow. And if you look real close, you can see he's giving the cat a little drink. And I know Jana will appreciate that. So the Liberty Bell was in Philadelphia. It was owned by the city of Philadelphia. It's been transferred to a national organization now. But the Liberty Bell had been to a couple of World's Fairs before, but it had never traveled west of the Mississippi River. So about 75,000 school children contributed and signed a big petition, and they got the Liberty Bell to be put on a special train and be brought to the St. Louis World's Fair. And when that train traveled, it was greeted kind of like the president or the Pope coming through town. It was a holiday in all the little towns along the train. The mayor and governor maybe would come out, the band would play, and people would want to touch it. Well, of course, it was going to be displayed in the Pennsylvania building. And it was in its own little, guarded display there. And I came across in one of the little photo albums I have a personal photograph that someone took of the Liberty Bell on display, same one. And you can kind of see the people are blurred because inside photographs had to be exposed for 5 or 10 seconds to be decent. Now, St. Louis World's Fair was originally scheduled for 1903, and they found out in order to get Europe to participate, they needed more time. So they delayed it to 1904 to give the European countries more time. And they also found out about that time that the 1904 Olympics had been awarded to Chicago. St. Louis threatened to have a bigger and better athletic competition and basically blackmailed the International Olympic Committee to move the Olympics to St. Louis. So the first Olympics in the Western Hemisphere were held in St. Louis. They made an artificial lake for the diving and swimming competition. Washington University had constructed an athletic field with the first or second concrete stadium in the country. They had all the traditional athletics, weightlifting and jumping and running. St. Louis is notable because it was the first World's Fair, being the third one. First one was in Greece, the second one was in Paris. It was the first one to give out not just a trophy to the winner, but gold, silver, and bronze medals to the winners of the various athletic competition. George Poage was the first African-American to win Olympic medals. And George Iser, who's in the middle, in one day, he won 6 medals in gymnastics, despite having a wooden prosthetic leg that he had lost as a child. Most people have heard of Helen Keller and knew that she was 19 months after birth, she was afflicted with either scarlet fever or meningitis, which left her deaf and blind. So at the age of 7, she learned to communicate with Annie Sullivan, becoming quite educated. She attended the Royal Institute for the Blind in 1888, and she graduated from Radcliffe in 1904 at the age of 24, becoming the first deaf and blind person to earn a Bachelor of Arts degree. She visited and toured the World's Fair on Tuesday, October 18th. The Helen Keller Day was declared to promote education for the deaf. She's mainly remembered as being an advocate for people with disabilities, and she died in her sleep in 1968 at 88 years old. Another famous person that came to the fair was Geronimo, the most famous Indian warrior and Apache chief in American history. He is reputed to have taken about 100 scalps. He was captured by the Army in 1886 and was a federal prisoner in 1904, and he visited the World's Fair under guard. Visitors could buy his photo and autograph for 10 cents, or they could pose with him for 50 cents. You could even buy his hat for $2, and he would take a new hat out of a box and put it on when the person left. After the fair, Roosevelt invited him to march in his inauguration parade in 1905, and he did so in full regalia. Now, the Gerhard sisters were some of the people that were photographing the fair and famous people there, and they took this high-resolution photo of him displaying Geronimo as a very dignified former leader of the Apaches. And as they did this in 2009, just 13 years ago, the Smithsonian took a good look at that high resolution image and looked at his left eye, which you can see in the upper right. And when you zoom in, you can see that the photographer wearing a white blouse is leaning in towards her camera. Pretty good resolution for 1904. A little blurb about the Fort Shaw Apache Indian School girls basketball team. In 1900 or so, the late 1800s, the US was working to assimilate teenage Indians into American culture at many Western Indian schools, such as Fort Shaw in Montana. The girls developed a very good new team to play basketball, and basketball was quite different from today's game. You were only allowed one dribble, you had to pass the balls, and there was a premium on shooting. So they and their coach played their way to the World's Fair, winning games about every 50 or 60 miles where they'd stop and eat, maybe spend a night playing a local team. And they would, at halftime, perform Shakespearean pantomimes. As Shakespeare was read, they would dress up and do little pantomimes as the stories were read. They beat all teams, and in St. Louis, they won the World's Fair Championship trophy, defeating an all-star Missouri girls team 2-0 at the World's Fair. Now, St. Louisans love this because when you drive around Forest Park, which has, I guess, 27 holes of golf in it, you'll still see some fire hydrants along a road where there's no buildings nearby. There's still a few hydrants scattered in Forest Park that are oddly placed, but they once protected fair buildings. While the original hydrants have been replaced with new caps, they all connect to mostly the original pipes. So now we're getting down to the exciting things. Some of the night views, I put a whole bunch of these in just to show you the use of electricity to light up all the buildings at night like it was daytime. The fountains would become illuminated. The big tower was illuminated. There's Festival Hall and the main cascades coming down with the lights underneath it and the colonnade of states on either side. The fair's centerpiece, Festival Hall, was designed by Cass Gilbert, who also designed our central library. It could seat over 3,000 people for concerts. The dome was larger than the dome of St. Peter's Basilica. Palace of Electricity, some of the outside lighting was supposedly designed by Thomas Edison, and that's a day and night view of the same building. And there's a daytime shot of Festival Hall with the cascades and the colonnade and the Grand Basin. And you can't quite see the art palace behind it in this view. You're a little bit too low. The Palace of Art is behind it back here. And it was made out of limestone, and it kind of didn't match the white. Everything you see here that's white is made out of staff. And I'll show you a piece of staff in a little bit when I get the camera back on me. There's a close-up of going up Art Hill, which was about 80 feet high, and you can see the size of the people walking up and the size of the statues. And then you can see the great waterfall of the Cascades pouring down through all of these pools that were built on the way down. Well, inside Festival Hall was the world's largest organ. It had over 10,000 pipes. It took 14 train cars to ship from its manufacturer in Los Angeles, who went bankrupt because of cost overruns. The console had 5 manuals or keyboards, 140 stops, and 239 movements. It performed with the symphony and famous organists from all over the world, including Alexandre Guillemot from France, who is recognized as the world's best. There you can see the 5 keyboards and all the buttons he'd have to pull. After the fair, the organ was purchased by John Wanamaker of Philadelphia. Oh, this is the largest pipe in it, 32 feet long, big enough for a small Shetland pony. He purchased it for his Philadelphia store, which had a humongous central court. And when he first put it in and played it, it was good and it was loud, but he said, it's got to be louder. So they expanded it. There's a picture of the central court inside the store today, to over 28,000 pipes. It's a National Historic Landmark in Macy's, and it's still played 2 or 3 times a day and gives special concerts. I've talked to people who have seen it. Here's just a little blurb of it. Well, rather than listen to that a long time, I do want to get through and focus on what I think is some of the most fun things to see here, the Ferris wheel or the observation wheel. Weighs about 4,200 tons. It was originally designed and made for the 1893 Chicago World's Fair by George Washington Gale Ferris. I think a lot of that stuff was in the handouts and stuff that I sent you all. And it was at the fair for, I think, 5 out of the 6 months that it was open. And after the fair, when it had to be shut down and moved, he didn't want to take it apart. So he paid a company to take it apart, move it to North Chicago and put it back together. And he built his own little amusement park in North Chicago called Ferris Wheel Park. He opened it up there, and there's even a little video of it slowly moving behind a building that you can find on the internet. And then in about 1894-95, George Washington Gale Ferris got divorced. His company went bankrupt, and he died. And so for the next 7 or 8, 9 years, the Ferris wheel continued to operate, losing money every year without his push and drive behind it. It was sold at auction. This Ferris wheel to put together and the steel in it probably cost $40,000 or $50,000 or more. It was sold for a mere $8,000 to the Chicago House Wrecking Company, who bought it thinking, well, at least we could blow it up and sell it for scrap if we had to. But about 1901, 1902, they realized St. Louis was going to have a World's Fair too. And since it had been taken apart and put back together, they negotiated with the St. Louis World's Fair people to bring the Ferris wheel to St. Louis for the World's Fair. And they negotiated a pretty good contract that almost guaranteed them making money. And when you look at these cars and you realize these cars could hold 60 people, they were about 13 feet by 26 feet. If you're in a room that has ceiling tiles are usually 2 foot square or 2 feet by 4 feet, and count enough tiles to give you about 13 feet wide and 26 feet long. And you'll just go, holy cow, they were that big. Well, yeah, 60 people might be a little snug, but they generally didn't put more than about 20 or 30 people in the car because there just weren't that many people waiting to get on. But a lot of special people wanted to get on. In fact, the first day that it was open at the end of May, a wedding party showed up, got in a car and got married when the Ferris wheel got to the top. Same thing happened a few days later. So they started decorating one of the cars to be the wedding car. And in fact, one brave couple had them build a small platform on top of one of the cars and got married on top of one of the cars as it was going up and around the Ferris wheel. There's about 8 or 10 people in that wedding car. And as good as that shot is, I have to wonder, where's the photographer standing? So I have some shots here I want to show you of the Ferris wheel, just to show you the scale of this and how it had to be put together. So I'm going to go over to my browser and show you about 3 or 4 shots. That's the same shot we were just looking at. Can you see the people that are working on making the wheel? Probably not. Can you begin to see some of the people? Oh, can you see a few of them climbing around on that Ferris wheel? Notice they all have hats on. That looks like a toolbox. There's a guy holding on. There's another guy up here, and they're waiting for a crane probably to lift another piece of steel up to put it in place and get it connected right. And when you zoom back out and you realize this axle up here that weighed 70 tons, everything is being connected to it, you know, with 2 towers on each side. You have to wonder, how did they get up there? Well, let me see here if I can spot it. There might be a better shot of it. I'll show you the ladder in just a minute, maybe on the next shot. Okay, so here's another shot of the Ferris wheel being a little over halfway done. And now, having looked at a person, you can undoubtedly see that, oh, there's a guy over there. He looks pretty relaxed, just moseying along on one of the pipes or one of the beams. Here you can see the axle a little bit better and everything connected to it with 3 or 4 inch steel rods. And they would make temporary platforms that they would then use to put cranes on like this, like they're doing over here, to lift things up. But these guys over here are probably getting ready to lift something up over on this side of the wheel. There's another couple of people there. And when you see people clambering around this, it looks like, you know, ants climbing up the side of a house or something. Okay. Can you spot any people yet? Can you spot any people yet?
See a couple.
This one is really sharp. I think there's 12 or 13 people up here. And they're getting ready for these cranes to lift things up so that they can get them connected. This guy up over here, in fact, there may be another guy up here, is making sure that this piece gets really connected well. You can also see on the outside of the wheel the sprockets that were built onto it and added onto it to make the wheel perfectly round. And these sprockets are what made the wheel go around, because they basically had a bicycle chain, a giant bicycle chain at the bottom of the wheel, that these sprockets, these little gears, would meet up with on the bottom and basically spin the wheel around from the bottom. You can also see a little diagonal ladder for people to get up higher. And I think this one, yeah, this one has the ladder. So the axle is down here. This goes up a little bit above the axle, maybe 140 feet tall. Remember, the wheel was 250 feet in diameter. But can you see the ladder that they climbed up to go to work?
Oh.
Can you see this ladder right in the middle, basically on one of the big vertical things? I would assume bolted on, or probably some 2x4s, and they would have to climb straight up this ladder 120 to 140 feet to get to work every day. And if you had to go to the bathroom, you had to climb down this ladder to go to use the facilities down here on the ground. Here's a picture of the Ferris wheel cars all lined up. You can see that they are built on a steel framework with I-beams. Each car weighed 13 tons, 26,000 pounds. And the bottom was very well supported. The windows were plate glass and also had bars on, just to make sure that no one could take any liberties or anything. So there's the wheel, you know, getting a little bit more done, and one more shot of the wheel. Almost done. And I know now by now everyone can say, oh, I see some people. There they are, lining up this temporary cross beam to make sure the spacing is right, so that these cranes, temporary cranes, and you can see that these are temporary, you know, diagonal or controlled with pulleys and stuff like that, to lift up pieces of the framework that all probably weighed many hundreds of pounds and had to be all bolted together. They've got the inner ring done. Now they've got to put the extensions to the outer ring and then put the outer ring on also before they can begin connecting the cars. I don't think there's any cars on this shot yet. Oh, there's one car on it. And you can see the buildings of the fair in the background.
Mike, Andrew has a question for you real quick.
I'm sorry, I can't hear that. You'll have to get closer to the microphone. My volume's not working real good.
So Andrew has a question for you. Go ahead and ask him.
Yeah, how many cars were there on the Ferris wheel?
Oh, my goodness. I left out a couple of very important numbers. Each car, I talked about the size, and it could hold 60 people. There were 36 cars, basically like a protractor every 10 degrees around. So there were 36 cars, 60 people apiece. The capacity was 2,160. But I doubt that they ever approached even 1,000 or maybe even 800, because any photograph I've seen, even on the busy days, probably a third of the cars are empty and the rest of the cars only have 20 or 25 people in them.
All right, thank you.
Because it cost 50 cents to ride the Ferris wheel, which was the same amount as it cost to get into the fairgrounds. Doesn't seem like much today, but you know, that was basically like you know, paying $25 to get into Six Flags and then paying another $20 to ride a roller coaster.
Yeah.
Okay, so back to the slides. And we saw this, and we saw that, and we saw that, and we saw that. So there's the wheel at night. And this is a photograph that I first saw about 10 years ago. And I started looking at the stages of light on the Ferris wheel and going, what are those beams of light shining out from it? And I showed that to a guy who's been studying the Ferris wheel as long as I've been studying the fair. And he said, wait a minute, I've got some pictures of the Ferris wheel and there's something on top of one of the cars. Look at that. And he found another shot, very similar. Looks like a little robot, not quite like R2-D2, but there's another thing with the car, something on top of the car. And he kept looking into it. And he eventually found out in Denver, Colorado, how about that, Ellen? At Lakeside Amusement Park, now over 100 years old. When the park was first created in 1908, the tower was the tallest structure in Colorado. I bet it's still there, that tower on the right. And it was originally topped by a spotlight used on the Ferris wheel at the St. Louis World's Fair.
Interesting.
One of the little
Yep, I've been there.
discoveries along the way that every few years I find a new discovery.
Very.
So the Ferris wheel was put in Forest Park, and as the fair progressed through the summertime, the LPE company that was running the fair and the Chicago House Wrecking Company said, okay, what are we going to do at the Ferris wheel? Well, can we leave it there? That's the best, easiest thing, and maybe make an amusement park around it. The locals said, no way. And the contract with St. Louis required its removal to restore the park to being a park. They tried to sell it to Coney Island or Forest Park Highlands, a local amusement park, and they would have to pay to take it apart, transport it, which wasn't very much by train, and then put it back together. And they'd make their money back in probably 2 years. Neither of them wanted to do it. So they demolished it. And third alternative, sell it as scrap. And there were people who would buy all that steel, including the axle. The axle was probably worth $1,300 in 1906, which is around $30,000 today. But blowing it up was apparently the only alternative. And in May 1906, the wheel met its fate and basically collapsed upon itself into a pile of rubble. There's the axle kind of sticking in the ground. And you can see for scale, there's a man closer to the camera here, kind of blended in with all these rods and cables, you know, that were once the magnificent wheel. But the urban legend in St. Louis persisted of, where's the axle? People thought, well, that's too heavy to move, and it was never reported that it was taken anywhere. All of the rest of the scrap was cut up, put on a train, and sold to be melted down and stuff. But keep in mind, the axle had been previously moved 3 times. It was not too heavy to move. The train tracks were still in place and were in use for salvage. And after demolition, the removal of the axle wasn't newsworthy. It was just more salvage material leaving St. Louis. And there's a lot of documentation that my friend Steve, who's studied the Ferris wheel for 25 years, got from the original company, which was a family company. And even though the axle couldn't be cut up back then because it was hardened steel, the acetylene torches were improving, and the owner said, I'm not going to sell it cheap. I'll take it back to Chicago before I sell it cheap. And here's a letter where at the very bottom, it said it was shipped to Chicago on 2 flat cars. It remained in our yard until 1918 or 19, at which time, by the use of acetylene torches, the shaft was cut and sold for scrap. Here's another article that was only recently discovered. The last of the Ferris wheel was taken away, including the axle, which was embedded. It was pulled out, and it was found necessary to blow off the flanges of the axle before it could be loaded onto a train car. So for those of us who have read this and read some of the other documentation from the Chicago House Wrecking Company, we're convinced it went back to Chicago. So a few things of legacy from the fair. This will go pretty quick now, and I'll be able to take some questions. Millions of souvenirs and memorabilia. And I'm going to exit out of this for a minute and show you a few things I have. Something that got me interested in the fair was handed down to me from my parents. This is a little piece of ruby flash glass. It's a toothpick holder. And it says on one side, St. Louis World's Fair 1904. And it has my great-grandmother's name on it, Philippi. And in a family Bible, she's called Philippia. There were all other things like a little pocket mirror with a picture of a World's Fair building on it. And besides those things I showed you, I've also been able to find in Forest Park several pieces of staff, which are basically white rocks that if I scrape it with my fingernail, I'll end up with a little bit of powder on my fingernail, because they're basically plaster with horsehair or a little bit of burlap tossed in it for mixture. And it could be poured and melted like plaster of Paris, cut and molded and nailed onto wood and buildings. And that's what all of those buildings that you saw over the last 45 minutes were made out of, was staff on the outside of a wood framework. Another legacy was clean water. St. Louis water, like many other frontier waters, was noted as not being real clean. And it was nicknamed from Mark Twain. It's too thin to plow and too thick to drink. But with the World's Fair coming, they had to find a way to keep everything clean. Otherwise, all of that plaster would soak up all this dirt. And a St. Louis city employee, John Wixford, came up with the solution implemented just weeks before the fair opened. We'll skip over the little video of that. But lo and behold, he produced millions of gallons of clean water, and that method is still used today by using a whole lot of lime and, filtering the water. A couple other things that were built for the fair. We talked about the art museum. We'll come to that. The building in the center of this was made out of cement, the Portland Cement Building. And when that land became part of the zoo used it as their veterinarian hospital for a while, for many years. And it also served as restrooms, but eventually in the 50s or 60s, it was taken down to make a train station for the Zoo Line Railroad that encircles the zoo. The flight cage was built for the Smithsonian, 82 feet long, 50 feet wide, and I think about 50 feet high, open air. Although it was divided in half almost. On the right side, you can see of this picture, you can see that there's a vertical separation, so that on this side is where the large birds were. That separation goes up against the side of the tunnel that people would walk through to see the birds, and smaller birds were on the other side. The original framework of the flight cage is still there today, although the foundation has been rebuilt at least twice. The Grand Basin is still there. The fountains that were there for the fair aren't in the same place, and the Cascades were all temporary, and they were taken down. But this shot was taken not too many years ago, and you can see where there once was a palace, there's now 50-foot trees, which is maybe almost the same height as that Palace of Education and Social Economy. Here we come to the Palace of Art, which was the one building they were required to build permanently, and what it looked like in 1904. Now, keep an eye on the statue in that alcove and the chimney, and then the statue on top of the cornice up here, because as we go forward about 115 years, there's what it looks like today, approaching sunset, where the sun is giving it a nice kind of orange hue. And just to go back, you'll see those changes that I mentioned, but the statues over the entryway are still there. The windows still appear to be pretty much the same, etc. One other thing I want to show you here is the panorama of the fair. And that's on my here. A couple of, an astute photographer, World's Fair enthusiast, discovered that there were 5 or 6 images all taken from the wireless telegraph tower, which I forgot to point out on that first shot that showed you the aerial view. And he figured out, oh, I can put these together. I can make a high resolution panorama. And he did that. And then we got somebody to do a little Photoshop magic and blend them together so that you can see the US government building and the Missouri building up here. You can even see some of the World's Fair state buildings in the distance back here. This is the Palace of Liberal Arts. And you might wonder what these little buildings are on top. Those buildings served 2 purposes. They were skylights to let light in. And as you'll see in another building, they could also be opened up to keep the heat from building up on the hot summer days. Another state building, there's Mines and Metallurgy with the obelisks. If you recall, we were looking at the sunken garden down in between these buildings. This is the Palace of Orleans. And can you see the army people in the car yet? There's a formation of army troops that were encamped down over here on their early morning walk. And can you see the cars yet? Well, there's one car and there's another little one there. There's a boat on this lagoon. This lagoon goes all around this building to the right. And lo and behold, you probably recognize that building by now. There's Festival Hall with the 2 of the Cascades going down to the Grand Basin. And there's the top of the art museum back there. This is the Palace of Agriculture, which was about a 1/4 mile long. The Illinois building back here. The Mosque of Omar in the Jerusalem concession. Here's the Palace of Electricity. Palace of Transportation is back here. Varied Industries here. And as you get further and further over, there's the Dome of Creation on the Pike. One of the few things tall enough to really show up. Some of the towers on the Pike in mysterious Asia. We'll see this in a moment, the statue of St. Louis, which is now over in front of the Art Museum. This is part of Ireland. And then we get over here to the Tyrolean Alps with the fake mountains that we saw. And this was the main entrance. And this is early morning, I think, because the crowd is just coming in. I'm trying to get it to focus. But the trolley cars would let people off and they had to walk underneath the train tracks through a tunnel and come up here to the main gate with their tickets and then go through turnstiles. And this is looking down at the model street and the enormous Palace of Manufactures with its central courtyard. And they put these together and it's just a really impressive product that they produced. So going back to the slideshow, two things that were from the World's Fair. I do want to mention that the statue of St. Louis was made out of staff and plaster in 1904, but it was so nice that after the fair, it was cast in bronze and put on a marble base and moved to this location in front of the Art Museum. And it stood as the symbol of St. Louis from probably 1906 when it was installed up to the 1960s when the Gateway Arch was completed. And the Gateway Arch kind of superseded it, being on the riverfront and just a little bit taller. But like I did with the Art Museum, keeping the memories alive of what it was like back in 1904, there's the same statue in 1904, and it had a little subgroup of two angels talking to a maiden that represented the city of St. Louis. One of them was called Genius Points, and the other one was called Inspiration Whispers. And what it looks like today in that plaza. So with that, I think I've been going for about 45 minutes or more. I've tried to hurry up a little bit at the end, but I think you can tell when I get talking, and it's just so much fun to point out some of the amazing things of the scale from the size of the buildings and the size of the Ferris wheel. You all have your handouts. I'm fairly familiar with them. I think I can answer any questions you might have.
Yeah.
So how do people decide where to have the World Fairs, and why did they decide for this one in particular to have it in Illinois or St. Louis?
Well, up until I'd say World War II, anybody could have a World's Fair. Any city could organize and have a World's Fair if they wanted to. And in the 30s, there were a lot of World's Fair, also the 1930s. Before then, same thing. If you wanted to have one, you organized one. No one was really controlling it. But I think around World War II, there's an International Federation of Expositions that was formed. It has a fancy French name. And they now kind of control the big international expositions to every 10 years. And in fact, one just took place, delayed from 2000. I think they held it in 2021 in Dubai. I think in 2010, Beijing had one. In 2000, Hanover had one, working my way backwards. So they still have some of the bigger ones, but they're much less, what's the right word, grandiose and thematic, because in today's world, you know, starting after World War II with satellite communication, television, radio, we're able to see things now that, you know, our parents and even your parents when they were young could barely believe that, hey, I can sit at my computer and I can go look at a live image of people at the Eiffel Tower if I want to. But they kind of control the World's Fairs, which are less promotional about countries and states than they were back then, but they still, you know, promote the different countries and different themes. Good question.
Thanks, good question. Angie, you want to ask your question?
What countries of Asia were shown in the Mysterious Asia exhibits?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Can you speak just a little bit louder?
What countries of Asia were shown in the Mysterious Asia exhibits?
What countries of Asia would they see in Mysterious Asia? Was that your question?
Yes.
Okay. Well, one thing I've learned is the countries of Asia of today are different than what they were back then. For example, Turkey in the Ottoman Empire occupied most of Eastern Europe and what is from Poland all the way down to the Baltics, kind of like the division of Yugoslavia into 4 or 5 different countries that's taken place in the last 15 years or so. So it was basically the Asian culture with a lot of ill-defined countries to show the Asian rugs and camels and, just a really different culture. And they bring food to or spices to make their special dishes and, serve in their restaurants. And it was the first time that people from the Midwest and St. Louis in particular could go to a place and they could get, some genuine Irish stew or some dishes from Asia, or I'm trying to think of some of the other ones. At any rate, to visit the world and, see their culture. Japan and China exhibited, and, get some Chinese food.
Thank you.
Mhm. Anything else? Ellen, Susan, any questions that I've kind of missed or didn't cover?
I have a quick question. First of all, I just completely commend you on all the work that you did on some of these photographs. I think the investigation of the photographs is something that I hadn't thought about. And I think that's good for these guys to see that, because sometimes we look at photographs and we don't really do a lot of investigation. So I want to commend you about that. But one thing that struck me as I was seeing the scope of this fair is who funded the fair? Did the taxpayer fund it, or were there donations from outside people, or both?
That's a very good question. They started organizing the World's Fair back in 1899 or so with a big committee of people, and started getting the support of the city and the state. They did consider some other locations in the city of St. Louis, although New Orleans also wanted to host the 1903 World's Fair, which was delayed to 1904. But once they settled on St. Louis and all the states got behind them, they set a goal of $15 million for the organizers to get, and they asked the government for federal government for a $5 million loan. They sold stock at $10 a share, and they sold 15 million. That's not right. They sold enough shares to get another $5 million at $10 a share. And then they also got $5 million from the state of Missouri to host this, because the state of Missouri knew this would bring people to St. Louis. It would be a construction boom. And so with that $15 million, once the federal government approved that money, they got serious. They selected a site. They started figuring on a layout. And before you know it, they were starting to award contracts to construction companies to build those 8 large exhibit palaces, because those were the biggest construction efforts. And, before you knew it, early 1902, there were orders going out for so much lumber. I think it's amazing there were any trees left out west.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Anything else?
I think I have one more question. Sort of, what about the World's Fair do you find interesting, and what are some of your favorite facts about it?
Well, what's interesting in favorite facts? I think you could tell by my presentation. The Ferris wheel is probably one of the most amazing engineering feats. Although there were bigger wheels built, none today could ever carry 2,000 people. I think they've got a 500 or 600 foot Ferris wheel now. The fact that they made so many big things with just steam shovels and the crude pulleys and cranes. The fact that they organized this all in 2.5 years with barely using the telephone and doing almost everything on paper communication of letters. no faxes or, computer transmittals or anything like that.
Yeah.
Jenna, you're unmuted. You got any favorite fact about the fair?
Well, as I think you know, I've always been fascinated with the floral clock. But since I have joined the society, I've learned a lot about the other things, and the questions that these kids have been asking are very, very well crafted. It's hard to say what is best because everything is amazing. And the fact that David R. Francis, who was the president of the company that put together the fair, wanted an emphasis on education and enlightenment, as opposed to the World's Fair that are very, very modern in the last few years, where it's mainly about people trying to sell their whatever it is they're selling. But Francis wanted education, and that was how it got wonderful to me because, for example, scientists in every discipline came to St. Louis to have a congress to share the details about the things that they have discovered. It was very pro-science, and it was, well, that's it.
Cool. Thank you so
Well,
much.
I would go on a little bit, and something Jan and I talked about, and I started looking for it, but I can't find it quick enough. David R. Francis and his staff wrote a couple of big books that talked about the history of the fair and go into great depth, and those are online. They're called The History of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, and also the Universal Exposition of 1904. David R. Francis wrote a 2.5-page preface in retrospect. And he talked about how we started off doing this and how amazing it was and everybody came together, et cetera. And he wanted to emphasize the progress in learning. He had conventions of almost every large group, from librarians to school teachers to newspaper people to construction people to arts and sciences, which was a international congress, they called it, as a convention, where people brought some of the latest things of science and trying to discover the nature of the atom, et cetera, and presented papers to each other. And he closed it with a quote, and I'm paraphrasing here because I don't have it memorized. There was so much knowledge and information gathered here at the St. Louis World's Fair that if, by some unspeakable catastrophe, the world was wiped out and it lost all of its knowledge, the knowledge contained here in St. Louis could support the rebuilding of society.
Oh, yeah.
That's right.
And that's a pretty big egotistical statement to make, but he really believed that not just the construction or the countries or the food and the restaurants or the Ferris wheel, the entertainment, the knowledge that people brought here was just amazing. And that's what he saw as the purpose of the World's Fairs. Other people will write about World's Fairs, and you'll probably learn about this. I know there's at least one author who's an expert in a lot of the different World's Fairs, who thinks that the purpose of the World's Fairs was largely to promote the supremacy of the European American race, so to speak, over other people. There are other people who had the purpose of, well, it is our Christian duty to try to elevate the standards of all the people that don't have the benefits of our education and stuff like that, like they were doing with the Indians. But it was probably inappropriate to want to wipe out the Indian culture. And that part is really derided. But of course, that's looking at it with 115 years of hindsight. And that's the kind of stuff that as you get older and get into higher grades, your teachers will probably go, yeah, there's things that were not done as the way we would have done them today, certainly, but hey, this was back then. Anthropology was new. And I bet you guys had never heard of what was called the monkey trial or the Scopes trial, where this teacher in Tennessee wanted to teach the science of evolution. And the school board said he couldn't because it goes against the Bible. God created man, and that was how man came to be. Well, big debate, and now I think evolution is an accepted fact, but God's hand certainly was guiding it. You can have different interpretations on it, but that made national headlines and stuff, and it was a very controversial subject back in the early part of the 1900s.
We are going to touch on that just a little bit, particularly the anthropology exhibits, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. So yeah, these guys are kind of prepared for that. We did talk about it a little bit yesterday. So yeah. Is there any way you could send me the quote that you said about if civilization died tomorrow, we'd have the blueprints for?
Oh yeah,
I
I
have
just
the
sent that
quote.
to Jana about a week ago.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I've got it.
Okay. Yeah, we'd like,
Great.
I'd like to have that. That's great. Well, thank you so much for speaking to us. These guys are really paying attention and ask great questions. And we thank you so much for coming to speak to our students at Knox. I wish they could have all been here, but
Yeah.
someone will record it. Someone will send me the recording, correct? So I can post it.
Well, it is still recording.
Yep.
I'm
So
going to stop the recording now.